G'day guys, I've just returned from Geelong Heresy where I went undefeated, winning Best General, running the Goretrack Detachment for the World Eaters. So in today's video I'm going to break down the event, break down my list, and talk about some of the reasons why Goretrack is a serious contender as a competitively viable World Eaters detachment. Let's get into it.
Exalted.
Unlike some other gaming systems, Warhammer 40k often requires an absolute boatload of dice to play. For example, watch me roll out my attacks with these 20 Khorne Berserkers. Follow the links in the description to get your Exalted dice today. Alrighty guys, before we go any further, I do have some very important caveats to draw here. Geelong Heresy is a bit of a squirrely event, so it's a 3,000 point event instead of your traditional 2,000 points, so that brings a lot of changes to the meta. They also have some variations on the missions, some slight customizations. They're generally pretty standardized, but they have like these unique little twists in there that throw some spanner in the works as well. Geelong Heresy is also notorious for people bringing lots of big things. So there was lots of knight armies and things like that. So it wasn't exactly your standard type of event. And one of the other things about Geelong Heresy is that there's very interesting tables. Some of the tables are your standard sort of L-shaped WTC style ruins, and then some of them are completely wild tables with very little terrain on them. So it's not exactly a standardized event, so take everything that's said in this video with all of that context in mind. And basically, the reason that I ran Goretrack at this event is because I thought, given that it's not a super serious event, given that all of these various factors, it's a good opportunity to test out Goretrack, test out some different strategies, some different combos, see whether or not they work in an environment where I'm not going to get super punished if they don't. And then if it does work, it might be something that I consider for an upcoming more serious event. And so even though the event itself wasn't super serious, some of the combos that we tested, and I found out some things that work really, really well, some that don't work very, very well, it's still worth having the conversation about that. So with that being said, I think the best place to break it down would be to first talk about my list. Then I'll do a summary of all of my opponents' lists. Now, the event is not in Best Coast pairing, so I can't pull up their exact lists, but I can give you a bit of a summary of their lists. And then I'm going to break down all of the different combos, the tricks, and the various pivotal moments in the games that were specific to Goretrack, and whether or not, at the end of that, we consider Goretrack to be competitively viable. So with that being said, let's jump in first and have a look at my list. Alrighty, so here's the list here. Now, like I said, it's 3,000 points. One of the other things is that they have the rule of 4 instead of rule of 3 to accommodate for that larger size of event. So we had Khan the Betrayer as our Warlord. We had 4 Slaughterbound. Now, one of them had Infernal Fusion, which gives his unit a once per game fights first ability. One of them had Unleash Hell, which is basically his... if he disembarks from a vehicle this turn, you can't overwatch him. And then the other is Murderous Onslaught, which is that if his vehicle shoots an enemy model, that model is suppressed, or that unit is suppressed, and they have -1 to hit until the start of your next turn. And then the final one had no enhancements. So lots of Slaughterbound. Then we had a unit of Khorne Berserkers, that's obviously for Khan, and the Rhino for Khan to go in. And then we had 3 Land Raiders, so we're really leaning into the Goretrack here. And it's a bit of a meme, but it turned out that the Land Raiders were absolutely fantastic. And I'm going to break down the Land Raiders in detail, because I think they're being overlooked. After what I was able to do with them this weekend, I think there's a serious argument for including a Land Raider, even in your normal Berserker Warband list, but particularly in Goretrack. So there was 3 Land Raiders, then we had 2 units of 2 Chaos Spawn, we had 3 units of 8-bound, then we had 3 units of 3 Exalted 8-bound, and a single unit of 6 Exalted 8-bound. And basically, so you'd have 3 units of 3 8-bound, 3 units of 3 Exalted 8-bound, and a Slaughterbound for each Exalted, and they would go inside the 3 Land Raiders, right? So that's the sort of standard kit for those, and then the unit of 6 would take the Slaughterbound that has the Fights First enhancement, right? Then we had 2 Hellbrutes with their fists and hammers. I love them to death, and they are even better in Goretrack because they can run through walls, they can reactively move, they can do all sorts of crazy things. And then we had a unit of Jackals for stickying our home objective. So that was the list. And there's lots of things to discuss here. I think it's probably best if we break those down as we talk through the pivotal moments from the games themselves. So that was my list for Geelong Heresy. Alright, cool. So now let's talk about my opponent's list. So it's a 4-round event because of the larger size. They do 2 games on the first day, 2 games on the second day. Because, 3,000 points takes about 3.5 hours as opposed to your standard 2.5 to 3 hours. My first opponent was running a relatively standard meta Chaos Demons list, but basically expanded into 3,000 points. So he had the Great Unclean one with the Endless Gift. He had Scarbrand with a couple Bloodthirsters. He had Fleshhounds, Nurglings, Blood Crushers, all of the Rendmaster, all of the standard things that you see in a competitive Chaos Demons list, just expanded to be 3,000 points worth. So when we played that matchup, it felt sort of similar to a standard game, just we both had a little bit more stuff than normal, right? The second matchup was into Blood Angels, and again, it was a very standardized Blood Angels list. He had lots of fights first. He had Blade Guard with a Judicia. He had Dante with a unit of whatever they're called, Sanguinary Guard. He had Lamatis leading a unit of Death Company. He had a bunch of characters, so a real standard sort of Blood Angels list, but again, expanded up into that higher points, field. Then on day 2, I played against a Chaos Knights player. He was running Lords of Dread. He had a Fight First Atropos. He had a Rampager. He had 2 Lancers. He had Despoiler. He had a few War Dogs as well. So again, a relatively standard competitive Chaos Knights list, just expanded into the higher points. And then my final game was into probably the weirdest of all of the lists, which was an Imperial Knights list, and he had a Porphyrion. I believe that's the type of knight, the big one with the big fuck-off cannons. Really, really big knight. So he had that. He also had a Castellon. He had Canis Rex. He had Crusader. He had a Gallant. No, not a Gallant. He had a Lancer as well. And then he had like an Immolator with a Priest inside of it. So as allies. So that one was definitely the least standard of the lot, but it was also one of the most terrifying because a lot of the tables didn't have a great deal of terrain. In fact, I'll throw a slideshow of the tables up here. But yeah, a lot of the tables didn't have a ton of terrain, so that big scary knight sitting in the corner just could see almost the entire board. Absolutely terrifying. So they're the 4 opponents that I played against, and that gives you a bit of an understanding of what I mean when I say that this event is a little bit silly. It's a little bit out of, the standardized meta. But I still think that it shouldn't be discounted because we're still playing 40k. The things that work in this competitive environment are going to work in this environment, and the things that don't work in a competitive environment aren't going to work in this environment. So it's still 40k, still standard, You still need Exalted 8-bound to pop tanks, you still need Berserkers to pop Horde, all of the standard facts of competitive 40k still apply to this less competitive style of event. And it's not even necessarily less competitive, it's just less less conventional, I think is probably the best word for it. So yeah, it was still a really interesting event, really, really interesting matchups. And Goretrack did some really, really cool things that I was really impressed with. There were some areas where it let me down, and I was, desperately wishing I had taken Berserker Warband. But there were probably more areas where I was surprised and impressed by what the Goretrack Detachment was able to do. So with that being said, let's pull up the Goretrack rules, and we'll go through them one by one, and then I'll give you some examples of how I was able to use each one of these rules in my games at Geelong Heresy. Exalted40k.com, where you can find a huge range of our apparel, a massive range of gaming merchandise, our community section, and our downloads library. Visit exalted40k.com today. Alright, so the first thing to talk about is the detachment rule for Goretrack, which is that basically every time you disembark from a transport until the end of that turn, you get +1 to your charge rolls, and you gain the Lance ability. Now, these were both really, really impactful. So your standard unit of 8-bound, they're strength 8 on their attacks, and in Berserker Warband they go to strength 10, but in this they get Lance, right? And Lance was actually quite often better than the +2 strength. So for example, when I'm going into the toughness 11 on those knights, if I was running Berserker Warband, I would have been strength 8 going to strength 10, so I would still be wounding on 5s. But in Goretrack, I was strength 8, which would normally be wounding a knight on 5s, but I get Lance, so it goes to 4s. So it was really, really good on the 8-bound. Obviously, didn't matter on the Exalted 8-bound because they got anti-infantry, anti-monster, anti-vehicle 3-up. But it was really good on Khan's unit as well. There was lots of instances where that Lance actually was quite helpful. But the +1 to charge rolls actually swung a few matchups in some really interesting ways. So one of them is that if you have a Land Raider with 8-bound, Exalted 8-bound inside of it, and you bring that on from Strategic Reserves, because it's just under 500 points, that package, you bring that on from Strategic Reserves, and then you can disembark as part of that, and then you can go for a charge roll. And because you disembark this turn, you actually only need to roll an 8 from Deep Strike, or from reserves, as opposed to the standard 9, because you still have to be 9 inches away, but because you get that +1 to your charge rolls, all of a sudden, bringing things on from reserves and going for a charge isn't as horrible of an idea as you might think. Especially when you've got 2 units inside that both disembark, so you've got 2 opportunities to roll that 8, and if you take the army-wide reroll charges, you now essentially have 4 opportunities to roll a single 8-inch charge. That's pretty likely, and now all of a sudden, you're able to send those units in from reserves, and your opponent doesn't have an opportunity to block you out, to screen you, or anything like that. So that was a really effective strategy that I was using quite often, was a Land Raider would come on from reserves, the 8-bound and the Exalted 8-bound would disembark, I'd shoot something with all of the las cannons and the heavy bolters and do a bunch of damage, and then charge. And so the Land Raider was sort of fulfilling the role of a Forge Fiend. Normally with the World Eaters, you'll have a Forge Fiend, you'll have it in Strategic Reserves, it'll come on and it'll shoot something. So the Land Raider was fulfilling that role, whilst also being a delivery mechanism for Exalted 8-bound and 8-bound. And one of the other things that was really good about this is that you could rapid ingress that Land Raider if you wanted to, and then in the next turn, move the Land Raider, then disembark, and go in and charge and do crazy damage. So that's the Land Raider package, but the point here is that +1 to charge rolls from the detachment rule was actually really, really helpful. And it also just meant that I didn't fail any charges throughout the course of the event, because the amount of times that you'd be like, cool, I'm 6 inches away, so it's going to be a 6-inch charge, you'd roll a 5, and then you'd be like, oh, that's right, I have +1 to charge because I disembarked from my Rhino this turn. Brilliant, right? And the +1 to charge may not sound like a lot, but it really just, there's nothing worse than when you set up an entire play and you fail that charge by 1 inch. And this just means those instances don't happen. So, really, really happy with the detachment rule. There was, obviously, losing the +1 attack and +2 strength did hurt in some instances. There were definitely some times where I was like, God, I wish I had that +1 attack. The Exalted 8-bound going in with 4 attacks each instead of 5. Big difference, Even just Khorne Berserkers going in with 4 attacks instead of 5. Like, you really did feel the power level of your units drop. However, one of the things about the World Eaters at the moment is the power level isn't really a problem. We tend to kill the things that we charge pretty reliably. So losing a couple of attacks here and there isn't as big of a deal as you might think, and it's definitely not as big of a deal as failing charges is, because you fail a charge, you don't get any attacks. So, losing that one attack in order to gain the increased probability of making the charge, I think is actually quite a reasonable trade. The only other problem with this detachment rule is you only get it on a turn in which you disembark. So if your opponent's able to deal with your transports early, then you essentially don't have a detachment rule. So there was a couple of games where people would blow up a Land Raider, I'd disembark out in that turn, but then it ticks over into my turn, and now those units don't have a detachment ability. However, I think this is one of the reasons why the Goretrack detachment works really, really well with Exalted 8-bound, because their anti-monster, anti-vehicle 3-up means they don't really care for Lance, they don't care for +2 strength, they don't care for any of that stuff. So they're kind of agnostic when it comes to detachment rules, which means they work really, really well with the Goretrack, because they're not always going to get a detachment rule. So yeah, I was really, really happy with the way that detachment rule worked. Let's have a look at the enhancements now. So I took Murderous Onslaught. Basically, it's a world-used model only, and basically, if you disembark from a transport, you can't get overwatched. Now, it didn't actually come up in the event, except for the one game where I was versing the Blood Angels player. He had a Land Raider Redeemer, which had the capacity, obviously, to overwatch quite scarily. However, what ended up happening is, where I put the unit that has the Ignore Overwatch, he just made sure that his Redeemer was on the other side of the board, and as a result, the rule didn't really come into effect. However, that in itself is value, right? Being able to go, cool, I'm putting my no Overwatch guy here, and then he goes, cool, now, might have wanted to put his Land Raider on that objective, but now he has to put it all the way on the other side of the board, because otherwise I'm going to disembark Exalted 8-bound that he can't Overwatch, and then I'm going to charge that Land Raider, and I'm going to blow it up. So he knew that he had to stay away from those Exalted 8-bound with the no Overwatch, which allowed me to kind of bully his Land Raider and force him into areas of the board that it might not have wanted to go traditionally. Aggressive deployment, now this one I didn't take, however it is very, very good, which is basically it gives Scouts 9 to a Rhino that your guy's inside, which means you have to put it on a Master of Executions. This is really, really good, but I decided for this event, because I was predicting a lot of heavy vehicles, I wanted to go with a lot of Exalted 8-bound, and they don't get benefits from this because they can't go into dedicated transport. They can only go in Land Raiders, which are not dedicated. So we didn't end up taking that one. Next is Unleash Hell, and basically this is the one that allows you to suppress enemy models. So you basically, if you shoot an enemy model, you can go, cool, that model is suppressed, and until the start of your next turn, it has to subtract 1 from all of its hit rolls. This actually came in clutch. There was a game against the Chaos Knights where I brought this Land Raider on from reserves, shot at one of his Lancers, and then I charged both of his Lancers, fought the other one first, so that when he interrupted with this Lancer, he was hitting me with -1, which meant the Exalted 8-bound survived, which meant they were able to then fight and almost killed that Lancer as well. So this was really, really effective, and it's only 10 points. And being able to just suppress an enemy model is really, really good. So I think this is a must-have. Even if you're putting it on a Rhino or something like that, is pretty good. And you don't necessarily have to be inside that. You can be near a transport, so it can be quite useful, this one. And then last but not least is Infernal Infusion. So this is the absolute game breaker, 25 points, and basically once per battle at the start of the fight phase, you can give the unit fights first. So this was on my 6-man Exalted, and these guys swung a lot of matchups. So basically what I was doing with them is I was dropping down and I was charging anything that's really good at shooting. So Knight Despoilers, Crusaders, things like that. Killing the shooting, and then sitting there in the open and being like, cool, now you've got to try and charge me to kill me, and when you do, I'm going to activate fights first, and I'm going to kill whatever just touched me. So this was really effective. Another really cool thing you can do with this is you can rapid ingress and then heroically intervene with fights first. So imagine a scenario where you've thrown Spawn out into the center objective on your first turn. Let's say you go second, so your opponent has his turn, then in your turn you throw your Spawn out. Now it's your opponent's turn 2. They go to charge your Spawn, and they want to kill you off of that objective. and you just go, cool, you've moved your unit up, you're about to charge those spawn. I'm going to rapid ingress this Exalted 8-bound unit right behind the spawn. And now, if you charge the spawn, I'm going to heroically intervene with the Exalted 8-bound. I'm going to tag your unit. Then we're going to go into the fight phase. Because I have fights first, I'm going to kill your unit in your turn. And then we're going to take over to my turn. And now those Exalted 8-bound are up the field because they've rapid ingressed and then charged something with the heroic intervention. And then they're free to go off and hit other things. So this is absolutely busted, especially on a big unit of 6 Exalted 8-bound. Now, in a game of 2,000 points, you might not have the 6-man Exalted 8-bound. You might opt for a 3-man. I think that that unit, though, was well worth its points. Very expensive unit, but it was flipping matchups, and I can see it doing a similar thing in a 2,000 point game. And this is something that the Berserker Warband can't do. The Berserker Warband wishes they had access to fights first on Exalted 8-bound. So even in a mirror match, like, how's the World Eaters players going to play around that? They're going to really struggle. So yeah, I really like this, and I think that it's one of the things that makes Goretrack particularly attractive. Alright, now let's have a look at the stratagems for Goretrack, because some of these created some really interesting synergies and combos. So the first one is Endless Pursuit of Violence, and basically you can, at the end of the fight phase, one World Eaters unit from your army and one friendly transport that it's able to embark in. If you're wholly within 6 inches of that transport, you can embark within it. So there's 2 really, really awesome ways that you can use this stratagem. One of them is you can move up your Land Raider, disembark, charge something, kill it, and then jump back in the Land Raider after you've killed your opponent. That's really, really effective. But another really cool one is, if you move up your Land Raider, you disembark your 8-bound, and then you roll your charge. If you fail your charge, right, instead of now being sitting in the open, you can just spend a CP to get back in the Land Raider after having failed a charge. So this was really, really good when I was bringing that Land Raider on from strategic reserves, firing its las cannons at things, rolling my charges. If I failed a charge, I'd just jump back in the Land Raider. And now your opponent turns around and they're like, well, I've got to try and kill the Land Raider just to get at the guys that were inside. And if you're smart, you bring it on in an area where, like, you can see your opponent, but once that thing's dead from las cannon shooting, your opponent's going to have a really hard time getting angles on your 8-bound or on your Land Raider. And then even if they do, they kill the Land Raider, you're going to disembark the 8-bound out the back, and it's going to be very hard for them to also get angles on those 8-bound. So this stratagem, I think, is one of the detachment defining stratagems. It's very, very good, and it's pretty cheap, only 1 CP. So yeah, they're the 2 main ways to use it, is to either, like, for example, I used it in one game with Khan the Betrayer's unit, where basically I disembarked Khan's unit out, moved them up, charged something, advanced the Rhino up right next to him. Then after I fought, killed the thing that I was in combat with, I've jumped back inside the Rhino. And now your opponent turns around and they're like, well, I was going to try and combat Khan, but now I need to pop a Rhino first, and they have to reallocate their resources. Can be very, very effective, this stratagem. I'm a big fan. Next, we have Smash Through, 1 CP. Basically, a vehicle can move through walls. So, obviously, this is fantastic on Hellbrutes, because now you can rapid ingress your Hellbrute behind a wall somewhere. Your opponent can't shoot it, and then in your turn, you can just charge straight through the wall, or move straight through the wall, and then charge your opponent, which means you don't have to go all the way around, which is one of the things that can really limit a Hellbrute's effectiveness. So this is really, really good on the Hellbrute. But the other thing that this is really good on is just massively increasing the movement of your Land Raiders and your Rhino. You can have a Rhino staged really close in behind a wall, and then instead of having to go, cool, I'm going to move the Rhino around like this, you can just go, cool, I'm going to move the Rhino straight out, and then I'm going to disembark, and I'm going to charge some stuff over there. So this is really, really effective, especially when paired with some of the other stratagems. So we'll go through all the stratagems, and then I'll talk about how some of them link together. So aggressive disembarkation. This one's pretty cool. It basically allows you to disembark 6 inches instead of 3 inches, and you can disembark into engagement range with your opponent. Now, the disembarking into engagement range isn't really that exciting, because if you do that, you didn't declare a charge this turn, so you're not going to get your lance, and also your opponent's going to get to fight you first because it's an ongoing combat. So that part, not particularly interesting. This does do a few things, though. It means that if your opponent tries to wrap around the vehicle, they can't stop you from disembarking, which is pretty cool. And then the other one is that it allows you to gain additional movement. So normally you got your Rhino here, you'd disembark out 3, then you'd move your 8 inches for an 11-inch move, and then try to charge things, right? Whereas this allows you to disembark out 6 inches, and then move 8 inches for a 14-inch disembark, which is obviously much scarier. Now, this one pairs well with the next one, which is Full Throttle Assault, which is that a Rhino in your army can basically move, then disembark and charge. So normally with disembarking from a vehicle, if the vehicle remains stationary, you can disembark, move, and then charge. But if the vehicle moves, after you disembark, you can't then move that unit because it's kind of already moved, and you can't charge after because the vehicle moved. Now, Land Raiders have the Assault Ramp ability, which allows you to move the Land Raider and then disembark the guys. But the Rhino, with this stratagem, has it as well. So now, if you have 3 CP in your pocket, you can actually pull off a pretty sick combo, which is you've got a Rhino hiding behind a wall somewhere. The Rhino now moves straight through the wall, so it moves 12 inches up. Then you spend a CP to disembark 6 inches, so now you've moved 18 inches because you've got your 12-inch move of the Rhino. Then your disembark of your 6 inches, so you've moved 18 inches. And then, if you spend another CP, you're eligible to declare a charge, even though you disembarked from a vehicle that moved. So you can move 18 inches and then charge through walls. So that was really effective in one of my games because some of the terrain at Geelong Heresy was very, very light. So I was bringing my Rhino in and it was ages away from my opponent because there was not great staging areas. But being able to just go, cool, I'm just going to move 12 inches to the other side of this wall, then disembark 6, then charge, I was able to close that gap pretty effectively. So that's really, really powerful combo. It is 3 CP, of course. You don't necessarily have to use all 3 of them, though. Like, you might have a situation where you don't need to go through the walls, so you can just move your 12 inches up, disembark out your 6, and then charge. Or you might have a situation where you don't necessarily need that 6-inch. You might be able to go, cool, I'm actually just going to move through the wall over here, and then disembark and charge. There's a few different ways that you can combo these together, depending on the situation you find yourself in. But yeah, Full Throttle Assault is a really, really cool stratagem. The next is Unrelenting Advance. Your opponent's shooting phase just after the enemy unit has shot. One Worldier's vehicle can make a normal move of up to 6 inches, and it cannot be targeted by this if it's already been targeted by Unleashed Fury, which we'll go through in a moment. So this was really, really good. Being able to get shot at, then moving out of line of sight is really, really good. Or there was one game where I moved my Land Raider up where it was 6 inches away from an objective marker, and my opponent was like going to shoot me, but he's like, no, because if I shoot you, you're going to move forward 6 inches. Now you're going to be on the objective marker, and your Berserker or your 8-bound just got 6 inches closer in my turn. And they're like, I don't want that. So they actually just neglected to shoot me. They didn't want to shoot me at all because they didn't have the guns to reliably kill me in shooting. That it would take them multiple activations to kill me, and they didn't want me basically skirting around the board gaining extra inches. So that was really effective, and this is one of the things that I refer to it as a 0 CP stratagem, because yes, it's technically 1 CP, but what ends up happening is the very fact that you have this stratagem means that people don't shoot at you because they don't want you to use the stratagem. And as a result, you've essentially gained the benefits of the stratagem without spending the CP on it, because your opponent then just doesn't shoot you, so you're gaining a benefit because they would have otherwise shot you. They would have just laid into that Land Raider. But because I have this stratagem, they don't shoot me at all, and it didn't cost me any command points because they don't shoot me. So that's a really, really effective tool to have in your toolbox. So making sure that you have a CP handy at the start of your opponent's turn, so that if they try to shoot you, you can be like, if you shoot me, I'll reactive move. That's really effective. Another one is things like if your opponent has the ability to, like, say they shoot you with a small weapon first to remove your cover save, and then they're going to unleash on you. It sort of deactivates those sorts of combos, because if your opponent shoots you with the small gun, they turn off your cover, but then you reactive move out of the way, which is one of the things I was able to do in the final game. The opponent moved up his immolator, shot at me with his heavy bolter in an attempt to remove my cover, and I was just able to go, cool, now that you've shot at me, you did no damage, I'm going to reactive move, and I'm going to move over here. He still ended up killing the Land Raider, but it made it a little bit harder for him. And he got a little bit lucky on some dice with his Castellan to pull that off. But yeah, that's a really cool little combo. It's basically just either reactive moving onto an objective, reactive moving out of line of sight, or reactive moving into somewhere where, you know, maybe you've got a Rhino out in the open, your opponent shoots at you, you reactive move somewhere near a ruin, so that then when the next unit shoots you, you can disembark safely inside the ruin. You know, there's tons of combos you can use with this one. It's really, really effective, and it's really cool. And the last one, I didn't actually get an opportunity to use, but because, again, this is similar to what I was talking about, that 0 CP style of play, where it's basically in your opponent's shooting phase, just after they've shot at a Rhino, as long as the Rhino survives the shooting, so it has one or more wounds left, the Khorne Berserker unit inside can disembark and then Blood Surge move. So basically, it's like your unit getting Blood Surge move, but they're inside the Rhino when they get shot. You disembark them out there 3 inches, then Blood Surge, their D6 plus 2. Very, very cool. It never came up because I basically told my opponents at the start, and they all just neglected to shoot the Rhino because they didn't want Berserkers getting full scent from inside. But this is, again, it's another one of those things where it's a 0 CP stratagem, because you put the Rhino on an objective marker and you tell your opponent, hey, if you end your move within 9 inches, I'm going to reactively disembark, you know. And then they're like, ugh, okay, I guess I'll just move over here and then shoot you. And you're like, well, if you shoot me from there, I'm going to be able to disembark my 3 inches, then move D6 plus 2, so essentially moving D6 plus 5 inches. I can tag you even if you're 12 inches away. So now your opponent goes, wow, I can't even go within 12 inches of that Rhino, you know, or I can go close to it but not shoot at it. And it creates these situations where you're gaining all of this value from the mere presence of this stratagem. The fact this stratagem exists, you're gaining value, even if you're not eventually using the stratagem. You know, you're forcing your opponent to stay 12 inches away from you. You're forcing your opponent to shoot other things instead of the Rhino. And Rhinos are one of those things where it's a perfect target for your opponent to shoot, because they're not particularly tough, and if they contain a unit of Khorne Berserkers, they have a massive threat range. They're something that your opponent really does want to shoot and kill. But if you can put it in a situation where they can't, you know, pull this off... Now, it's worth noting that this doesn't combo with the Unrelenting Advance, so it's like if they shoot you, you can't reactively move 6 inches, then use this stratagem to disembark and Blood Surge. But you can basically say to your opponent, if you shoot me, I'm either going to reactively move or reactively disembark and Blood Surge. Like, it puts your opponent in this situation where they have to consider 10 different variables of how you could respond to the threat. And the more variables you give your opponent to consider, the more likely they are to make a mistake. And as you've got a lot of experience, the more you play the Detachment, you'll already know the correct answer. They won't. They'll have to consider that correct answer. So they'll be like, well, do I shoot it? If I do that, he's going to reactively move over there. But if he goes over there, he might go over there. And if he goes over there, no, what if he does that? What if he disembarks and then Blood Surges? And your opponent's just racking their brain trying to sort of figure this combination out. And you're sitting there going, I'm actually probably not going to do either of those things, because I want 2 command points so that next turn I can move this other vehicle through a wall and then disembark and charge. So you might not even be planning to use either of these stratagems. But the fact that they exist and you warn your opponent about them means that they have to spend considerable time and mental resources trying to solve that challenge. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Goretrack Onslaught Detachment. I actually think it's a bit of a sleeper detachment. The Hellbrutes go off in there, the Land Raiders go off in there, Khan and his Berserkers inside the Rhino are considerably faster in this. Yes, you lose the advance and charge, but you gain so much more movement because, first of all, the 6-inch disembark is kind of like an additional 3 inches, which is kind of like rolling a 3 on your advance and charge, right? So you're gaining that. But then also, a Berserker has an 8-inch move, whereas if you move the Rhino 12 inches, now you've gained 4 inches worth of movement, and then you can disembark 6, so you can gain an additional 3 inches worth of movement there. So you're gaining 7 inches, which is more than is even possible with an advance and charge. So the Khan and the Berserkers inside that Rhino are significantly faster in this detachment, and they're also better into certain things. Not everything, but that +1 to charge and that lance is pretty good, because first of all, the +1 to charge just means that that threat range we were just talking about projects even further, right? So you're essentially gaining 8 additional inches out of the Rhino. That's crazy. That's so much faster. But also, if you're strength 4 and you're going to strength 6 in Berserker Warband, that's going to give you +1 to wound into most things. You know, like if your opponent's toughness 6, instead of wounding on 5s, you now wound on 4s, you know, +1 to wound. If they're, you know, strength 8, you know, sorry, if they're toughness 8, you go from wounding on 6s to wounding on 5s, +1. You know, that most scenarios it's going to effectively translate into +1. Into toughness 5, it translates into +2, because 4 would be wounding on 5s, but 6 is wounding on 3s, so you get +2. But that's about it. And then there are some scenarios where basically toughness 12 or higher, it's not going to give you anything, because whether you're 4 or 6, you're still wounding on 6s. Whereas the lance, it's going to give you that +1 to wound into the same things that the +2 strength would, but it also into things like toughness 12, which knights are very popular right now, and there's a few variants of them that are toughness 12, or, you know, your greater demons, toughness 13 on the, you know, Nurgle great unclean ones, things like that. There's a lot of toughness 12 out there, and into those things you're getting significantly better, because you're gaining you're wounding those things on 5s, whereas even if you went to strength 6 in Berserker Warband, you'd still only be wounding them on 6s. There's also toughness 7. If you go from 4 to 6, you're wounding on 5s either way, right? Whereas in Goretrack, you're strength 4, so you would be wounding toughness 7 on 5s, but now you go to wounding them on 4s. So there's a few breakpoints where Lance is better than the +2 strength, and there's only the single breakpoint where the plus strength is better than Lance, and that's specifically in toughness 5. So I think that's something that people aren't fully considering, and the +1 to charge is also something that I don't think people are really appreciating. You know, +1 to charge on those turns you disembark is really, really spicy, and you compare that with some really tricky combos. You know, being able to have something like a Forge Fiend deployed outside of line of sight and being able to just pop it through a wall and then blast things with all of its guns, it doesn't care if it's getting +1 strength or +2 strength, +1 attack, because it's a Forge Fiend, right? If you've got 2 Forge Fiends in your list, that's a considerable amount of your list that actually doesn't care whether it's in Goretrack or Berserker Warband. If you've got those two, you've got Rhinos, you've got Exalted 8-bound, all of these things don't benefit from the Berserker Warband. So I think it's a very, very good detachment. There are a few things worth noting. One thing is that I really, really missed being able to sticky objectives on death. You know, that, like, not having that ability, that hurts. Increasing your AP by 1, that not having that hurts. And also being able to get a 3rd blessing is also really, really good. So there's a reason that Berserker Warband is the standard go-to, and there's a reason that it's the most competitively, you know, selected detachment. However, I think people are sleeping on Goretrack, and I think that playing around with it a little bit, you're going to find a lot of utility. And I think that the Land Raider in particular in Goretrack is quite spicy, because it's tough enough that it's going to get shot and then be able to reactive move, because it's not going to just die the second anybody looks at it. And those las cannons, 8 las cannon shots within 24, is really, really good. I was killing bloodthirsters, I was killing knights, I was just blasting things with las cannons. Really, really effective. You know, because you're getting on, it is hitting on 4s, but that means 8 shots, you're going to get an average of 4 hits. Most Land Raiders only have 4 shots. So you're essentially getting 100% hits as per a normal Land Raider's profile. So, and with the capacity to spike up. There was a couple instances where I spiked up and got like 6 hits. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, that Bloodthirst is in serious trouble now, because it just got 6 las cannons to the face. So the Land Raider is really good in that regard, and I actually think that the Land Raider sort of performs the role of a hybrid unit. Imagine if you took a Rhino and a Forge Fiend and smashed them together, right? And now you've got the transport capacity of the Rhino and the utility that that provides, but you've got the firepower of a Forge Fiend, slightly different, but slightly better in many cases. Forge Fiend isn't going to do much to a Bloodthirster. Forge Fiend isn't going to do much to enemy mech, knights and things like that, whereas the Land Raider's las cannons will. So the Land Raider's shooting is arguably better than a Forge Fiend. Its transport capacity is better than a Rhino. It's still only got the same capacity, but it can take 8-bound, whereas the Rhino can't. And also, you can move the Land Raider, disembark, and then charge, whereas the Rhino can't, unless you're using a stratagem. So it's got better transport capacity, it's got better shooting, and it's significantly tougher, right? And all of that for 220 points, whereas a Rhino and a Forge Fiend is like 255 points. So you're kind of combining the two things into a neat, tidy little package that's better. So I think the Land Raider is being slept on. I think Goretrack activates the Land Raider in some really interesting ways, being able to move through walls, being able to reactively move, these sorts of things. And yeah, I think I'm probably going to continue playing Goretrack for a little bit, maybe take it to some more competitive style events and see what I can do with it, because there really is some interesting stuff that you can do with it, and I think people are not giving it its due diligence. So with that being said, let me know what you guys think of Goretrack Onslaught. I know that this event wasn't the standard meta, so it's a little bit hard to make judgments based off that, but there's definitely some interesting stuff in there. And I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say about Goretrack Onslaught in the comments section below. With that being said, I'm going to leave it here. Thanks you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers. Exalted40k.com, where you can find a huge range of our apparel, a massive range of gaming merchandise, our community section, and our downloads library. Visit exalted40k.com today.